Well, last weekend was Independence Day, one of my favorite holidays of the year.
My all-time favorite holiday.
And we came into this one, at least for me, I came into this weekend wondering what this weekend was going to hold. It had a little bit of a weird feeling with everything going on.
Yep.
Governments all over the country, city, state, federal governments telling us you can't do fireworks shows, you can't celebrate in so many ways, you can't have people gathering. I didn't really know what to expect from this weekend. It actually almost felt the opposite to me. I happened to live on a fourth floor of a building that could oversee the entire western slope of Denver. Mm-hmm. And there were probably 50 shows going at once across my entire view from my balcony.
Right.
And they went for 3.5 hours.
Right.
It was just, we sat out there for an hour and a half and then realized, okay, the fireworks are all starting to get the same. We've played the same songs 5 times now. ROCK in the USA has been played enough times that let's call it a night. But I had a really great weekend. How was yours?
Yeah, it was really good too. The actual night of Independence Day was kind of quiet. We have a brand new puppy. She's 5 weeks old. I'm sorry, she's 9 weeks old. We just got her last week, and I mean she's a baby, and so she didn't want anything to do with the fireworks, which were going off all around our house. So we basically just stayed in and kept the doors closed. But it's an interesting thing about the fireworks. I think a lot of it, there's a lot of people who just love to see the dazzle. I love fireworks.
Sure.
Just the beauty of it. But there's a deeper purpose to the fireworks. I mean, the fireworks are supposed to be a kind of reminder. They are designed to look like scenes from an actual battlefield, and it reminds us that the fireworks remind us that real, actual, living, breathing, sweating, imperfect human beings had to go and shoot real guns and fire real cannons, detonate real bombs, kill real, live, living human beings who were government agents. Many of them risked and sacrificed their lives on fields soaked with real blood from real rebels in order that we today in 2020 can live freely if only we remember what that means, actually remember what freedom looks like. And that's the real purpose behind all the fireworks. And so I'm glad, I'm happy that Americans still shoot off their fireworks every year.
What made this one, I think, particularly special for me was we know that they weren't large venues. It wasn't the baseball teams and the soccer teams and Red Rocks and all of these big venues that we usually see. And I see this same show almost every year, never to this extent though. And this was individual communities getting together, finding companies, private companies, to come out and say, we don't care what the rules are. You've got a little lake in your community. We'll go shoot fireworks off the lake. And it was like this, they were like signals of patriotism throughout a city that for the last few months, we've sort of wondered.
Right.
And I think this is happening all over the country, right? We're sort of wondering, where are people feeling? And yesterday was that moment of, there are a lot of people out there who still really love what this country stands for, love the idea of Independence Day, love that symbolism, the rocket's red glare, right?
It'd be interesting to know how many people who were tearing down statues last week were shooting off fireworks, this weekend. I don't know how much of an overlap there is in those two Venn diagrams. The other thing I did this weekend, and it was a great way to spend a couple of hours. My wife and I watched Hamilton the musical.
Right.
And I've had read things and heard things, but I've never seen it. My wife had seen it in person in Chicago. I had not seen it. And we watched the movie version that's available now, and it's fantastic. It is glorious. It's beautiful. It's entertaining. It is faithful to the truth. One of my favorite things about it is it shows you how, in the course of the American Revolution and the American founding, these very flawed people, every one of them. I mean, you have particularly scurrilous characters like Aaron Burr, who ends up murdering the greatest anti-slavery advocate of the founders, Alexander Hamilton. But all of them had all kinds of failings, including Hamilton. and Jefferson and Washington and the whole host of these characters. And yet they did something good. They did something profoundly good. They did something without any parallel in prior human history. And they actually highlight this in the musical. So they spend some time during the Revolution, and you see Hamilton, he's the aide to George Washington, and they don't always get along. Washington at one point, actually, he gets so angry at Hamilton, he sends Hamilton home, and then later recalls him to come back to be his aide. But after the Revolution, the big question is, what's next? Nobody there in North America, all they were familiar with was monarchy. That's what they had known for as long as their memory could stretch back. And the question is, what are we going to do next? A group of officers actually approached George Washington and said, will you be our king? We'll pledge to you the full support of the army if you agree to be our king, because that's what we know how to do. We know how to live under a monarchy. And Washington, to his credit, he not only refuses and declines the offer, he shames them, he scolds them, he says, shame on you, this isn't what we're fighting for, right? We're fighting to be free people. But what does that mean, to be free people? What does it mean to create a free, self-governing constitutional republic that can actually defend itself and survive and endure? That had never been done before. The history of republics is a history of all kinds of petty civil wars and civil destruction and being conquered by bigger enemy regimes. So there's this great unknown. And here's this group of, again, highly flawed, highly imperfect people thinking and working and struggling their way through these challenges to found this wonderful experiment in self-government we call the United States.
And to that note, we had promised at the end of our last episode that we were going to continue our identity politics conversation today. And that's an important conversation because we were going to bring that into the founding and bring that into modern day politics. And I still want to do that. But in light of Independence Day, in light of the speech that President Trump made at Mount Rushmore, where he actually started the speech by talking about each of the four men on that mountain, I think it's worth our time and would be valuable to our listeners to spend some time today actually talking about these imperfect human beings who came together, each with a particular skill set that when combined changed the world.
Yep.
And I think we, in the spirit of Independence Day and in the spirit of the holiday and in the conversations that are going on out in public right now, I think it's worth us spending some time.
Absolutely, because it is an incredible, it's incredible and it's rare. It's so rare. Some people think it's miraculous, and it might be. It's so rare what happened at the time of the Revolution. I mean, let's give a little context here, Dave. What's your favorite sport?
I watch it all. So baseball, basketball, football. I grew up a diehard baseball guy.
All right, I'm a baseball guy. Let's go with baseball. If you were to build a baseball team that was going to be winning, going to be successful, championship team, what would you need to do that? I think the answer is you need a lot, right? You would need the best talent you could find at every position, and you would even need more than that, because to win, they have to work together. They got to form a team. They need to practice. You can have the best infield in the world, and if they're not practicing, they're not going to be very good at turning double plays and triple plays and picking off, runners trying to steal and that sort of thing.
Well, remember, and I don't want to interrupt and get off topic, but remember, we talked about that in podcast number 1. We actually talked about in sports, it's about muscle memory, right? And it's about practice and doing it over and over. And that's why we're doing the Vino Veritas Society, right? It's muscle memory to keep talking about these ideas and principles and how they apply to the world around you and the government and how we're supposed to live as citizens. Yeah,
and we're doing it right now, right? The more that we sit here and talk about this, the more familiar, the more comfortable we get with these ideas. So if you assembled the best baseball team ever, and it was very successful, and you had great talent, and they practiced together, and they worked hard, and a big part of it would be their attitude too, right? They would experience some setbacks. They're going to lose. One of the beautiful things about baseball is even the best in the world, strike out more than they hit.
Right.
If you had this great team that was very successful, Would you ever say that any one of those players was an angel, was a perfect human being in all ways?
Absolutely not. I mean, the two of the first 5 players you're probably looking at if you're building a team are Babe Ruth and Pete Rose.
Yeah.
And nobody, there's nobody in the world who knows a thing about those two who would say, well, those two guys were excellent human beings.
That's right. They were really good baseball players.
They were great baseball players.
Great baseball players, flawed human beings, right? But you need all that talent, all that skill. Well, the same thing with launching a revolution and winning a revolution, and then trying to stop a revolution and actually found some kind of regime based on, laws that are going to protect the equal rights of citizens. You need a lot of different characters, a lot of different players, a lot of different roles to be filled. That's what makes the American founding so incredible. I mean, think of the influence of the Declaration of Independence. It was aspirational, inspirational. It was a rallying point, a rallying cry. And you needed a philosophic poet, meaning someone who was not only poetic with his words, but understood these ideas so well that he could then present them in this beautiful, memorable language. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Thomas Jefferson.
That's Thomas Jefferson, right? You need to, and yet Jefferson, the funny thing about Jefferson, he was this kind of small, effeminate. Jefferson was not known for his physical or athletic prowess at all, contrary to someone like George Washington, who was this physically towering, imposing. He was a strong, tough dude. I mean, nobody, the toughest officers in the Army didn't mess with George Washington.
George Washington would be the quarterback. If you were starting a football team in the 1770s, George Washington is your number 1 pick.
That's right.
As your quarterback.
That's right. And you need, right, so you need a Washington there if the revolution is to be successful. If you don't have him, it doesn't work. And at the same time, there are a lot of colonists. Remember, these are Brits, they're Englishmen, they're colonists, who are kind of lackadaisical about the whole idea of revolution. Some of them are staying fully supportive of the king. They're Tories. Many others are like, I don't know, I don't really care one way or just leave me alone. They need a little prodding. They need a little inspiration, a little encouragement. So you need some rebel rousers like a Sam Adams, right? Who's up there. He's not the great philosophic mind, but he's the guy dumping tea into the harbor.
I hate using the example, but maybe the even better one, up until a point where he felt he was not getting his fair share, was Benedict Arnold, right? I mean, Benedict Arnold was the ultimate.
That's right.
You hear about these speeches he gave to the troops, and you think of Braveheart, right? I mean, Benedict Arnold was that guy in real life.
Yep, absolutely.
And then just never got his due, and
decides to turn coat.
Right.
And there again, right, it has become so fashionable, so popular, so easy today to criticize the founding, to criticize the founders. People who do that, I don't look at them as brave, courageous people. That's easy. That's the movement today. And we have Americans who are highly critical of the founders, and you look at everything that they were up against, including instances like Benedict Arnold. I mean, what an enormous setback that is. If you're George Washington, or if you're any of the officers or soldiers in the Continental Army, and you're thinking, good grief, how are we going to beat the British? Even if everything goes perfectly for us, the rebels, it looks like we're going to lose. I mean, we're outgunned, outmanned, outplanned.
Against the greatest army the world has ever seen.
And then you experience things like traitors in your own ranks giving information to the... This is what they were up against. And for Americans today to sit and wag their finger and, shame on you, revolutionaries. You didn't do enough good quickly enough. Man, they were on something that was close to a suicide mission. Right. They were scared to death. And every step of the way, there were all these pieces. I can remember when George W. Bush was president and we invaded Iraq.
Right.
And there was all this talk about Bush was leading this conversation about we're going to go build democracies. We're going to make the world's safe for democracies. We're going to democratize these parts of the world in the Middle East that have never known democracy. And I thought, well, that's a mighty ambitious project. When you think about building any kind of sustainable, stable, just democratic or Republican regime, there are a lot of elements you need. And I was asking myself, in Iraq, where's their George Washington? Where's their Thomas Jefferson? Where's their Sam Adams? Where's their John Adams? Mm-hmm. Where's their Hamilton? Where's their Madison? Where's their old senior statesmanly Ben Franklin?
Well, I was just going to bring your analogy all the way full circle. And Ben Franklin, you can't have a great baseball team without a great manager.
That's right.
Right? And the guy who can see who does what well and put them in the right place to be successful, right? There's a lot of guys out there who can probably do a lot of things really well on a baseball field. Doesn't mean you make them all pitchers. It doesn't mean you make them all outfielders. Babe Ruth might be the perfect example of that, right? The guy who started off as a pitcher for the Red Sox,
right,
ends up moving positions so he could play more and be more impactful, and he had a bigger impact when he finally made it to the Yankees because they moved him positions. So it takes the right management, and that's what the wise Ben Franklin, the elder statesman who had the experience.
Yeah, think of everything that was going on there. The two episodes really stand out in my mind about Ben Franklin, and again, the farthest thing from a model of moral perfection or moral virtue. Ben Franklin was not that. He was not that. He really liked to drink. He really liked flirting with ladies. He's not a model of perfect virtue. And yet, he's the guy in these key moments. The revolutionaries desperately needed assistance. They needed help. They couldn't have won it on their own.
Right.
And France looked like the most likely to offer some help. And the French people were very different. They were very sophisticated. They were into their ceremonies and their rituals and the formality of everything in a way that these colonists who were all farmers, that wasn't them. How do you bridge that cultural gap? How do you need someone there in France to woo the French?
Right.
Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is your guy. He's a scientist. He speaks multiple languages. He's fancy. He knows his wine, right? All these things. And there he is. And Franklin is indispensable in winning the French support coming into the revolution. Mm-hmm. And then you fast forward to the Constitutional Convention. And, by that time, Franklin's an old guy. And there he is. He's not real vocal. But at a key moment when the Constitutional Convention is about to break apart, these guys are fighting tooth and nail, insulting each other, yelling at each other. There's a lot of them are just ready to say, to heck with this, and pack up and go home. And old Ben Franklin rises. And everyone had this great respect for him because he was older. He was seen as sort of the elder statesmanly type, but also very smart, very learned, very erudite. And he offers a few words to just cool things down.
Right.
He looks at Washington's chair. It had sort of a half sun with the sun rays etched into the wood. And he said, I've often wondered if that's a setting sun or a rising sun. And I'm now convinced this is a rising sun, that this is the very beginning of a great experiment in self-government. Right. And it offers some perspective. It cools the hot heads down, and the Constitutional Convention proceeds. And we end up getting a constitution, right? And so every player, every character, every role is so critically important. And we had that in the United States. And against so many odds, these guys pulled off something that had never been pulled off before, founding a self-governing constitutional republic.
In President Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore, he focused on a lot of the tangible accomplishments of the men on Mount Rushmore. Mm-hmm. Focused mostly on Lincoln, which you and I appreciate. But he focused on the tangible accomplishments. He talked about victories in war. He talked about accomplishments in legislation. What I wish would have also been a part of that was accomplishments and ideas. These men understood things. And I think if we could, and You talk about these teams needing all these different parts, right? Vino Veritas Society is no different.
That's right.
You have a very specific skill set. I have a very specific skill set. We bring those two together. We add people to our team who bring their own skill sets, and that's how we grow this business and become successful at starting this culture revolution that we're looking to do.
By the way, those of you in the audience, we need lots of help. So please talk to us about that.
With that in mind, the historical and theory-based aspects of our founding are there's nobody better, right? I'm sitting across from the person. There's nobody better. So while I could talk about things in a way that a lot of people might relate to, I think introducing some of those ideas, some of those things that individual people did really well, that was the missing piece for me.
Yeah.
In Trump's speech. And I'd love to dig into some of those.
Let me give the president here some credit. So I did not see the speech or listen to it. I read it. And that's sort of how I've been doing that for many years. Important political speeches. I much prefer to just print it off and read it carefully. That way I can look back over lines, compare lines throughout the speech, see how the whole thing fits together. When you watch it live, there are always all these pauses for applause, and it's hard for me to follow a speech like that.
I will tell you on that note, we do know that Donald Trump likes to go off script quite a bit.
Right.
This speech was intentional. Right. And when he walks into a speech and when he delivers a speech,
right,
there are speeches where he's just, I'm going to rally my base and I'm going to make
my
fans cheer and I'm going to talk about all the things I want to talk about.
Yeah.
That wasn't this speech.
Yeah.
This speech was intentional.
Yeah.
He stuck to script.
Yeah.
It was practiced. It was thoughtful. It was,
and he certainly nodded in the direction of about the ideas. He had several lines in there about how these ideas represented by there's Mount Rushmore right up there, and the ideas introduced to the world by these men, introduced and used as a foundation for a regime. These are the ideas that led to abolishing slavery. And so he actually gave that credit, and I think he was right for doing that. Several things I want to say about some of the founders. I also want to mention Lincoln. Well, maybe I'll go in reverse order here and talk about Lincoln first. So when I printed out the president's speech and read through it, he offered some sort of mini biographies on Washington, Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Lincoln. Now, curiously, the only progressive up there is Teddy Roosevelt. People kind of forget just how enamored with progressivism TR was. And Trump had the least to say of all four of the presidents. He had the least to say about TR. He had the most to say about Lincoln, and I think that is very fitting. I think Lincoln's challenge was the greatest of all of them, and I say this with full and deep appreciation, respect for the great challenges the founders had, including what you just mentioned before, taking on the greatest military on the face of the planet, and then trying to found a new constitutional republic with really no models to follow, and all these unknown things. I mean, they were trying to create a self-governing, stable regime that was powerful enough to protect the people of this regime from foreign threats, but not so powerful that the government would become the great threat to the citizens. They were trying to create a regime of religious liberty. This was the problem that had, torn Europe asunder for hundreds of years prior to the American Revolution. The biggest problem throughout Europe were wars of religious persecution.
Right.
People dividing into often intra-Christian, but not always, doing terrible things to each other in the name of religion. So the founders wanted to establish a regime of religious liberty where every citizen would have his equal natural rights and equal civil rights protected by law and be free to worship anywhere, any way that they wanted to. There had never been a regime of full-blown religious liberty in all of human history. They were also attempting to form a regime where property rights would be secured. Think of the contrast, all the medieval European theocracies with which the founders were most familiar. There was no such thing as property rights. There was one property owner in each regime. That was the sovereign, the king owned everything. No one actually owned land. This is why they had landlord. We get the word landlord today from those medieval theocracies who managed the land on behalf of the king. But you couldn't just like divide up a piece of land and sell it off to developers, and that was impossible because it all belonged to the king.
And as I understand the history, that was a huge reason why the Washington family made their way to North America. They wanted to be landowners. They recognized that the only way to build wealth in the world at that time was to acquire and cultivate land.
And Washington was a Virginian, and Virginia is one of the very first, in the course of the Revolution, they abolish primogeniture and entail. And these are two legacies of medieval feudalism. Primogeniture was the legal doctrine that said if you were a baron or some kind of royalty and you basically managed a spot of land for the king, management of that land had to go to your firstborn son. Because you were blood related to the king, so it's going to go to your son to keep it in the family, right? In other words, you were not free to sell that land off to some bidder. Entail was the medieval feudal legal doctrine that said the land must be kept together. You can't divide a section of land into different parts and sell the different. You got to keep it together and keep it in the family. Virginia abolishes that in the course of the American Revolution. It says if you own land, that's yours. You do with it whatever you want to keep it, keep it. You want to sell it, sell it. You want to divide it into 10 different parts and sell some and keep it. It's yours. Do with it what you want. So all these things, right? All these are unprecedented. There's no historical model. And they want to abolish slavery. At the same time, all the leading lights at the time of the founding are talking about we've inherited this heinous, terrible institution. We got to get rid of it. We need to do that with the consent of the governed. Some people are on board. Others have deep financial business interests in slavery. They're going to be reluctant to get rid of it quickly. So those challenges were great. And all this is to say Lincoln's challenge was greater, because what Washington and Jefferson, the two presidents up there on Mount Rushmore, and the other founders, what they did have on their side is they had a nation of people who mostly, for the most part, were in agreement on the fundamental ideas. This idea that each and every human being has a rightful claim to himself. I have a rightful claim to myself, my person, my mind, my freedom, my choices. I have a rightful claim by nature, not by any law, not by permission from some other person, by the fact that I'm a human being and I have a, relatively free mind up here that can think and choose. And it means you have the exact same natural right to yourself. And so does every other human being. That idea had to be discovered. People don't know that idea. It's not instinctive. It's not intuitive. That was one of the most important ideas that had to be discovered. And what the founders had was a population that for the most part agreed with that. There was no big pushback. There was no big movement to reject that core idea in the Declaration of Independence. By the time Lincoln comes along, by the time he's elected president in November of 1860, large numbers of Americans are outright rejecting it, mocking it, making fun of it, saying it's just old-fashioned religious fanaticism, it's myths. Some of the smarter people were calling it self-evident lies. That's what was contained in the Declaration of Independence. And they were doing this in order to justify enslaving human beings. They didn't want this idea of universal natural freedom being introduced into their politics. They wanted to get rid of it. And so in that sense, Lincoln's challenge is really difficult when you think about that. How do you perpetuate freedom? How do you save the cause of freedom when a whole lot of people around you, your fellow citizens, say, we reject freedom. We reject the idea of freedom. Or they say, we think we're free, but those people over there, they're not free. They don't have any natural right to freedom.
It's the same argument that people are sort of making today, right? All those other cultures for thousands of years never said they're free, so why should they be free now? And I think about that same thing when people say to me, well, everybody in Europe gives universal health care, so why shouldn't we? Everyone in Europe does this, so why shouldn't we? The rest of the world does this, so why shouldn't we? We're a bad country because they're all doing these great things.
Right.
And for their people,
let's just turn
why
that.
shouldn't we?
Let's just turn that. Imagine if we were standing there in 1776 and someone said, you know, slavery is wrong because it violates this idea in our Declaration. It violates the idea of universal natural rights, universal natural freedom. And what if I said back, oh, but everyone else is doing it? Lots of other countries have slavery. Lots of other cultures have slavery. It's
lot. Every one of them.
That's right.
Every single country in the world in 1776.
That's right. And so, what this really boils down to is we seem to have embraced this cultural idea today of anyone from the past, if they were not morally perfect, then we must reject everything they said, everything they discovered, and mock and tear down and eventually ignore anything good that they ever did. And yet what that really means is it means human progress. Mm-hmm. These criticisms are being leveled by progressives. They say they believe in progress. Well, progress means morally imperfect people striving for something better, trying to do something better, trying to improve themselves or their country. That's the whole definition of progress. And what they're really saying is progress is impossible, because if anybody isn't perfect from the beginning, then we're going to ignore this. That we've been talking about that idea of freedom. And the idea, again, it has to be discovered. It's not everybody knows it throughout most of human history. People weren't talking about this idea. And even once you discover the idea, it's a big chasm to get from the idea to an actual government, actual laws, an actual way of living that tries to protect the equal natural rights of citizens, of people. And so before the Constitutional Convention, we had these two incredible minds coming from very different backgrounds. Alexander Hamilton, who just comes from miserable poverty in a little island nation, and James Madison, who's very sophisticated, grows up with private tutoring and the best schools and all of that. And both of them on their own, 6 months prior to the Constitutional Convention, they collect as many books as they could find on the history of constitutions. They wanted to know everything that's been tried by anybody they could find. They wanted to know about ancient Greek constitutions, Roman constitutions, European constitutions. They actually looked at models of different tribal constitutions of Indian tribes that had been in North America. They wanted to see what has been tried and what were the results. What were the strengths of different constitutions? What were the weaknesses? And my goodness, you need that kind of learning, that kind of thoughtfulness in order to design a constitution that's going to be in any way wise or good. And we had that in our founding.
And we had it, and they didn't agree right off the bat, right?
That's
You had Madison and Jefferson on one side of the table, who were both well educated, came from money, everything else, and you had Hamilton on the other side, and you kind of had Washington on that other side, right? There was always that theory that Jefferson and Madison were always jealous, saying Washington always sides with Hamilton.
Yes.
He always listens to Hamilton, and a lot of people say Washington saw a lot of Hamilton in himself. Or, Washington was the man of the house at 11 years old. He had to start figuring things out as a young man. He didn't get an education. His education was war. He went through all of those things, and you had Washington and Hamilton on one side of the table. You had Jefferson and Madison on the other side. But at the end of the day, they did agree on the most important piece of all of this, and that's that all men are created equal.
That's right.
It doesn't matter if we can debate and discuss and disagree, and it can get heated at times about how we get there.
Yeah.
But we need to agree on the core fact.
And here, this might be the most important context we can offer in this podcast today. When someone says, when one of our progressive friends say, well, Jefferson was a slave owner or Washington was a slave owner, and that's true, they were. One of the first responses would be, yes, they were among the millions of slave owners throughout history. Mm-hmm. There have been millions in all kinds of contexts. There have been millions of slave owners, and how many stood up and proclaimed to the world this universal moral truth that every human being has a natural right to their own freedom, and then try to build a regime on that? How many have done that? And the answer is none, except for the American founders. So when you look at the universe of slaveholders, a few really stand out in this one obvious way. Some tried to make moral and political progress,
right,
and create a regime that they held this idea up here as the goal, and they said, let's try to get our laws and our practices and our policies closer to that idea. And that to me, it's so ironic and sad that Americans today want to besmirch everything that the founders did because they weren't perfect from the get-go.
And I almost feel like Washington was a slave to the idea, right? I mean, he wasn't a slave to another person and can't relate to that experience. And I would never try to compare the two.
Right.
But Washington didn't want to go be a general in war. He was married to Martha. They had all this land. He wanted to take care of his crops and make money and build land because that's what his family did. He didn't want to go be a general and fight in a war that nobody thought he could win, that he was going to be hung in the streets for treason, and that he was likely going to die. And then the war was over, and he says, okay, I'm done.
Now
Leave me alone. I want to go home. No, you have to become president now.
Right.
Okay, I don't want to do a second term. No, you got to stick around for a second term. And then finally it was, all right, enough is enough.
Right.
But he never wanted to do any of that. But he was a slave to the idea. He, in his own heart, he could not abandon that idea.
He was certainly devoted to it.
He had the slaves that came through Martha's family, right? He didn't have any. He was too poor to have slaves himself as a young man, as I understood it. Most of them came when he got married. Then he said all of them are emancipated. The day Martha died, nobody can buy these slaves. These are free men.
Well, here's the again. You make a great point of, if you looked at the entire population of slave owners throughout history, we're talking millions of human beings. How many of those slave owners were offered total political power over a country by the army? How many slave owners have had an army come and say, please be our king, and we will pledge to you the full support of the army, and we'll crush anyone who disagrees or opposes, and then turns down the offer? How many slave owners? I can think of one, and his name's George Washington. Right. That's absolutely right. He's devoted to that idea, and yet we have to keep in mind those founders. Think about the world into which they were born. We at Vino Veritas Society talk a lot about the culture, the importance of the culture, ideas, opinions that are common, the vocabulary we speak, the cultural milieu in which we live. Well, what was their culture when they were born? Washington was born in the 1730s, right? As they're being born, every one of them, they were born into a world of slavery. That's what they knew when they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? In their formative years, they were growing up in and around the institution of slavery. And yet every one of those founders, as adults, they step outside of their own culture to look at their culture objectively and say, there's something rotten about that. That thing of slavery there, that's part of our past, part of our culture, it's ugly and it's wrong. And we need to start taking steps to get rid of it. And they do. They actually take steps, and they actually get rid of it. It's an amazing story.
And they wrote down the thoughts. And I think that, as for what we do here and why you focus so much on the original context, you can't dispute these ideas. You can't dispute that they believed in these things because they wrote them themselves, right? We have the writings.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. There it is.
And then you have the Federalist Papers.
That's right.
That describe all of this in detail, written mostly by 3 men, 2 of which really hated each other and sat and screamed across tables from each other.
Yeah.
Hamilton and Madison, and came from two different worlds, and
Yep.
they were able to have really thoughtful debate despite all of that and put it on paper for all of us
and
to
what's
see.
what's so wonderful about that paper is so you read the Declaration, that famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and then the naysayers, the critics, say, "Well, they didn't mean to include black people or other people."
Mm-hmm.
And then you turn to the Federalist Papers and you open up Federalist number 54, which is the one paper that offers an extended discussion of slavery, the problem of slavery, and it's presented as a problem. And what you find in there is you find this discussion of, these black slaves absolutely have the same equal natural rights to their freedom as everyone else. And the problem is the laws of certain states are violating those rights. So the solution is to change those laws, get rid of the laws that treat them as property, and start protecting their equal natural rights. It's right there in the Federalist Papers.
So I think we should leave it with that. The encouragement. I want to encourage all of our audience, all of our members. We're giving you readings here and there.
Yes.
But familiarize yourself with that. I hear people. I actually had somebody talk to me at one of our recent events, and then somebody else talked to me over the Independence Day holiday, saying, it's those little tidbits. When I can refer to those things.
Right.
Go back, read the Federalist Papers. Go back, read some of these books. Read the books that we're giving you,
and we're going to help. We're going to be guides for the thing. A lot of what we're doing through the Vino Veritas Society is going to revolve around original source materials, and you're not expected to master this stuff on your own. We're going to be the tour guides through this material.
Which is what the Toolbox videos are really all about.
Right.
I mean, we're going to talk about some of it here, and we're going to do some other things, and there'll be some other programs. But those Toolbox videos, so far, those who are watching them have just loved them. And I think
that's because they think my chalkboard is sexy.
You once an academic, always an academic. So with that, I want to encourage people to really keep sticking with this and sticking with the learning and understanding, because it does become so much easier when somebody says, well, yeah, but the Declaration was only written for rich white men.
Right.
Nah.
Not so much.
Let's look at Federalist 54 and then have a conversation all over.
What I hear you saying, Dave, is that to be a guardian requires practice. We got to practice being a guardian. And that's how we're going to live up to our motto. No sumos
custodes.
Custodes.
Absolutely. Thank you. See you next week.